Hi, and welcome to a special episode of our Experiencing Consciousness podcast. We are
Roxanna Erickson,
Catherine Rossi,
and I'm Jan Lipa.
We are so happy you are here. And welcome everyone to our podcast. I am Dr. Catherine Rossi with Jan Diba and Roxanna Erickson-Klein. And for our podcast today, we're going to talk about body-mind therapy within hypnosis. And this has been an interest of mine, I think, since I was born. And that right from the beginning of becoming a psychotherapist and also in studying psychology, I was really curious of where does the body fit in? And the vast majority of our field, they seem to be focused on cognitive, behavioral, emotional. And while that's good, I think there's more to being human than that. And one of those elements is the body. So the prefrontal cortex is going to be like, in the forehead region. And I'm really interested in the other 95% of the body joining in. So what do you think about that, Roxy?
Well, one of the things that's always been of interest to me is that my father's work, Erickson's work, he always wanted to get people up, moving, experiencing, doing this, doing that. And it seemed like really I would never imagine him saying, well, what do you think of that? He didn't start there. He's like, well, what does that look like? What does that feel like? Why don't you go over and explore it? Why don't you participate in some active physiological manner? And I think that integration of working through a problem with the physical body, with the senses, is really something that is a really standout feature of his work.
Well, I would add to that, because since you mentioned Dr. Milton H. Erickson, when I'm thinking about him and his work and his life and everything that he went through, I think that he had that kind of special kind of focus and experience connected with his body and with all the things that the body actually gave him and all the challenges that it actually brought on him. Wouldn't you say that this actually somehow created within him some special attention or focus towards that 95% of you of anyone?
Yeah, I think that his interest in the integration of mind and body predated his experience with polio. And when he talked to us about the experiments that he did with other kids to get them if he could follow them through the deep snow, and then he'd take a circuitous route. Instead of walking from point A to point B, he'd take this circular roundabout here and there and everywhere. And then he'd go back and he'd watch, are the kids that come after going to follow my footsteps that meander this way and that, or they know where they're going. We're all walking to school. So are they going to go straight from here to there? Or are they going to experience the meandering in a very indirect way? And so he was exploring this well before he was stricken with polio. And of course, once he had polio, then there was this gigantic disconnect of his mind was working, but his body wasn't responding. So he began to explore the rehabilitation of his body using his mind, and to reinforce to integrate it in a much, much deeper way than most people have the opportunity to do.
And you know, one of the things that Ernie said about Erickson, this is after Ernie had his stroke, and then what he said about Erickson was he was even better at rehabilitation than he was at hypnosis. And for those 8 years that Ernie spent with him, and Erickson taught him a lot about rehabilitation. And let me tell you, after Ernie had his stroke, so there was a certain paralysis, there was a difficulty with speech. There's, you know, that unfortunately, the integrity of his mind was left intact. It was just like a few of these physical things. And Ernie went right into being fascinated with what his body could do. And he never once, not once was he negative. He never felt sorry for himself. He had this superpower of knowledge of Erickson as in rehabilitation. And partly in naming the, you know, certain volumes of the collected works, you know, was really about rehabilitation. And I hadn't thought about it in this particular realm when we were thinking about this subject, but it becomes really powerful. And because we think about that, we work with people on emotional levels to deal with psychological problems. And yet, don't we all need to be well-versed in rehabilitation too?
So, so one of the things about the mind-body and body-mind connection is the way emotions and enthusiasm and positive attitudes express themselves on a physiological level that we don't even fully understand.
Yes, I mean, I would agree. And part of what we can do as psychotherapists is bring that to a conscious attention instead of just a habit. But and I think that sometimes when, you know, in using certain hand processes to help people enter into trance, so in using an induction method where you're looking at your hands as if you're seeing them for the first time, so it becomes novel of, and is one hand warmer, is one hand cooler? You start asking these sensory questions so that people can go into this body-mind experience instead of mind-body.
Okay, so let me ask you a question that you just started to give answer to.
Okay.
Because I wanted to ask you, you know, because what we are saying here, body-mind hypnotherapy, body-mind approach, and cognitive, behavioral, emotional, and the other 95%. So my question is, so how to actually do it? I mean, how to integrate this 95% into the therapy? How do you actually include the whole body and everything else into the therapy? And so I think my question is a bit about the model itself, but I think that if you could give us some examples, I mean, you know, how to do it, then we could kind of build on that.
Okay. I think that you know, in one of the simplest, easiest to access forms, because I can get, you know, out into the stratospheres of the joy of including the body. But when you think about the tried and true, what's likely to work for everyone, and so then that becomes practical. It really is the use of the hands, you know, hand models in the course of helping people to enter into a trance, helping people to be able to do what I call bypassing the conscious mind. Is that if we could just think things through, no one would ever need to come to psychotherapy because you would have thought it through. But we have to work on different levels of consciousness. So in some respects, it's like really direct but it's also distracting from the linear thinking mind. And so there, like, certainly whatever you see that person is doing physically is a subtle clue of where they are within the process. And often when you're sitting with someone in psychotherapy, all of a sudden their eyes will drift. It's like they'll look up to the sky or they'll look down. They're making a body-mind signal that they're going into a different state of consciousness. And so if you responded with the linear mind, what are you doing? You're not looking at me. Are you okay? You're going to bring somebody back into the conscious
you don't
mind.
pay attention.
Yeah, so it's like, hey, I'm over here, but the sensitive psychotherapist says, aha, they're going into a different state of consciousness. And that different state of consciousness that they're going into is trance. And let's follow them with these minimal cues to see where they want to go. Now, often that's the way that I work. But when you're learning how to do this, the simplicity of using the hands is really important. Now, why do you use the hands? Well, the representative of the brain, when you go into looking at the sensory motor aspects of the amount of territory on the brain that's dedicated to that, it is massive with the hands. And so when you think about success, and I want everybody to be successful and confident, why don't you go with that which is represented so heavily in the brain with the body? And it's going to be the hands, it's going to be the lips, the tongue, it's going to be the eyes, it's going to be the ears. So that's why you go in with the sensitivity, which is a word that Ernie almost always used. Look at your hands with great sensitivity. And as I say that to you, what happens, Roxy, when I say the word sensitivity? What's evoking you?
Engage the senses, sight, sound, feeling, sensations. You engage the internal working through experiencing. You engage the body.
And are you thinking about your problem as I say that? No, you're not thinking about your problem. You've been distracted for a moment.
Right.
Your problem. So, an element of hypnosis that isn't necessarily discussed maybe as much as it could is pattern interruption.
Yes.
And so in a really gentle way, in a really loving way, in a really natural way, when you bring in the focus on the body, that is consistent with what that person themselves is experiencing, that becomes the avenue of induction. And ultimately, when you're using I call it coming from a body-mind experience, because it's taking away the linear mind, you want to help a person enter a state where they're going to be open to what comes next. They're going to be open to maybe really diving deep into what the problem is, and hopefully to do that with curiosity and fearlessness. So engaging a tremendous amount of the brain in this process is to engage the hands and to engage the senses. Now, Jan, you were asking more on the procedures, I believe.
Well, general frame, and then some exemplification, so that people listening to us could, understand based on on some examples how to use that, or what does it actually mean. And by the way, when you said what is triggered when you say sensitivity, in my case it was something else than senses.
Yeah, what happened?
When I heard sensitivity, I felt it was basically, it turns my attention to feelings, because sensitivity means to me turning inward and like focusing on feelings. So I immediately, my attention went inside of me, inward, and focusing on where I am, you know, within my body. How do I feel? And so that's what happened. So automatically my associations were turn inward and focus on whatever happens in there. That's what happened.
Well, which brings up something that is vital, is everybody's going to receive it a little bit differently. And so it's those individual differences that means that we don't necessarily have a protocol. Do number one, then number two, then number three, and then number four. Is that each person is going to have their way that they naturally go into this, and which also going to be modified over time within that individual. So for and this is why when I'm asked for examples and things, it's just so darned individual. But the that really in the way to begin is with sensitivity, and whatever sensitivity means to that particular person. And if they turn to you and they say, oh, well, doctor, this doesn't interest me. I want to talk to you about, you know, my little brother keeps kicking me under the table, or whatever the problem is. Obviously, I'm bringing him the lighthearted problem. And then it's like, you know, that's true. And it means that they're not in that place where they can actually go inside. You have to give them, you know, like a few more minutes where they want to talk things through.
And some empathy.
And some empathy, and you know, some empathy, and often a little bit of humor, you know, when you're me, of you know, like really appreciating that, yes, that is really irritating, isn't it? But you know, in doing it in such a way that is good-natured about it. And then you know, being able to ask the series of questions. So this is part of that. A therapist is a really great therapist. There's a lot of good therapists out there. You want to be great, is that to be able to follow what the client is doing. And that typically when someone comes in to psychotherapy, so they walk through the door, hello, how are you? Sit down. They usually need about 20 minutes to debrief before they're able to go into any kind of meaningful therapy. And all of us have experienced this over and over and over again. And you know, where they're making that connection with you, they're also making a connection with themselves, and they're centering in. And so when you talk about, you know, like the strategies of what you do, you know, in being very sensitive, is this person ready to go into deep work right away? Sometimes they are, but if they're not, of, you know, understanding that this is the easing into it kind of situation. The idea is that everybody feels comfortable and safe to go into a place where they can explore. Is that how you see it, Roxy?
Exactly. That's what I wanted to ask. Wait. Because I wanted to ask that question a bit differently.
Okay.
I wanted to include in it generally my question was, so how do you include body in your mode of therapy?
Well, okay. So one of the, I'm recalling what my dad liked to do, and one of his favorite induction techniques, one of his favorite demonstration techniques, was the hand levitation, where he would sometimes, position someone's hand and then very, very, very carefully disengage and leave the individual's hand suspended in space. And then he'd go on. He would go on and make contact with them and just leave that hand suspended in space. And then he, at a different point in therapy, he would turn attention to, you know, what's that? And the person who would be at this point so deeply engaged in their trance processing would frequently look over and not even recognize that that hand is attached to themselves. And so he would make lighthearted comments about, whose hand is that? And use it as a technique to deepen their introspection and confusion and exploratory sense. And he'd laugh and say, well, what's it doing up there? Are you sure that it's your hand? So that was one of his techniques of really challenging our sensation of mind and body, because when you're deeply engaged in trance, you can leave it suspended essentially indefinitely, because you learn how to balance the muscles in just the right way that it's stable. But he used that as a technique not only as trance induction, but then he would use it as trance deepening, and he would use it as trance ratification, and he would use it to show the audience that something different is going on here. We're not in an ordinary state of awareness. So that was one of his favorite techniques. And it always amazes me that because this technique is still being taught in multiple places, multiple places around the world. And sometimes in a group induction, I'll see somebody lifting their hand like that. Okay, they've been through that before. They've been through that training. But and then at the conclusion, he would take or he would give permission. You can lower your hand now, whatever, at the conclusion, when he's ready to wake up the individual. But he would never interrupt the flow of the therapeutic work with getting back to the hand. That was just a tool for the induction, for the exploration, for the ratification, to remind them that this is a different experience. We're in looking at the mind, looking at the body in a totally different way. But in terms of my own, I rarely use the hand levitation technique. But what I use, and I just want to say, most hypnotherapists, particularly the beginning, training, start with close your eyes, take a deep breath, and get in a comfortable position. And that's kind of centering the body in a way that you can then escape your body. But that's kind of the standard entrance into a trance, that we're saying the body is not going to get in the way now. But what I like to do, my way of using mind and body with trance induction, and we're talking about procedural, is I like to begin with essentially a relaxation. I like to use formal trances, and I use a relaxation technique. And then I enter in my commands or guidance. I start using the confusion of taking voluntary deep breaths versus automatically breathing just as your body needs to. And I can really develop, that intentional and unintentional disparity in a very confusing way. So I'll talk about that for a while, and then I'll give it permission to deep breath. And by then, I've gone through it enough that I'm fairly certain that the subject is exploring their physical presence in a different and deeper way. And so that, for me, that's kind of a, guidepost into a trance state where now we can begin to talk about some other issues, that the other reasons for coming into the office.
It's pretty interesting, so often you use it almost like as a transition of helping a person, really getting into that space. And what I love about our talks together is that you work in one way that is, so successful, and I work in a way that's often the opposite, and yet we still get there. And this is such a big takeaway, is to find your own way. And I rarely, almost never, introduce anything associated with relaxation in the beginning. Almost never. And when I heard the story about Erickson, and he would describe relaxation, at least this was through Ernie, is that you do that after a job well done. It's like if you are on a farm, as Erickson was, and so there's cows to milk and this and that, that you go out and you work and you really put in a good day's work, and then you come home and you can really relax after a great day's work. And for whatever reason, that just seemed to stick with me. And so when I think about when someone is coming to you for therapy, it's usually because there's a problem, there's a trauma, there's an anxiety, there's a heightening of themselves, which is the polar opposite of relaxation. And I actually go with that, of like, even in part of it, can you, where are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Oh, you're at a 6. Well, that's pretty good. I wonder if you can make it up to an 8. I mean, this sort of thing of really going to the heights, because I know what goes up is going to come down. And that, so there's 2 schools of thought on it. And one is not right and one is not wrong. And it's any given situation of what it is. And so, I might even, like with the hand levitation, which is really fun. And Ernie taught me the simple skills of doing the hand levitation. And of course, everything works on me. So he would just barely touch the bottom of my wrists, and it would go, it would go up there. But that even it's like, wow, you really can't move that arm, can you? No, I really can't move that arm. You try to move it and you really can't. No, I really can't move that. Wow, it's uncomfortable because I can't move it, because it really wants to stay the same. It's like, okay, just let that go and let's see what happens next. And then what happens next is that they go away from their body. That it's like, all right, that's happening, then I'm going to go inside. And they're often primed really to go into the depth of what it is that they've been unable to face or ascertain, in going into what Jung used to call the deep night of the soul, where you have to look at things, experience things that you've been kind of avoiding because it's painful. And so for me, sometimes, like, the hand levitation, which, for anyone who hasn't experienced it, it's odd. It's really, really odd when you're thinking, wait a second, I know how to voluntarily move my arm and I can't, or my hand, and it doesn't want to. So you have to come to a comfort of that within yourself, knowing that you will be able to do it in time, you just can't do it right now.
And it's also a novel thing, so it brings
Right.
up numinosum, or at least neurogenesis effects.
Yeah, you know, I think that it will. I think that it will, but mostly when I've experienced it, and then of course there's the people, even if they haven't been trained in hand levitation, when people are doing some of these hand processes, and so maybe they're naturally pushing something away and pulling something towards them, and then sometimes there ends up being this paralysis, you know, in a certain position where it just plain doesn't move, which is akin to hand levitation that happens kind of all by itself. And so it's, well, by way of contrast, what does your other hand, you know, bring it into action? And it's where you're not saying what it is. And they might be going like all around with that hand that is, you know, I think the proper word is it's catatonic. It's just plain not moving. And because it's so odd, you can't help but be engaged with it, you know, when when you're experiencing it. And also, sometimes these methods have been used with people. They say, oh, I don't go into trance. Nope, can't make me go into trance. Like, okay, no problem. You know, and then they might go into one of these, and it's a little harder for them to deny that they're actually experiencing trance. Now, do I care if someone understands they're in trance or not? Not really. I want to have them to have an endpoint where there's a problem that's resolved, or another comfort that has come, or being able to ask a more pertinent question to the inside of themselves. But sometimes with this, you know, catatonia, that it's so weird that it like brings it to the attention of the person of, whoa, something's really happening here. I don't know what it is.
Right.
Have you had that experience, Jan?
Well, yeah. So sometimes when I, you know, especially when I started doing, not when I started doing hypnosis, when I started doing hypnosis, everything was novel. You know, it's like, I remember my first induction, I was 14 or 13, and I did that from a book, you know, and I did that like almost quoting everything. And then the guy, actually another 13-year-old, went into trance, and I was like, how the hell is that even possible? So everything, whatever, you know, happened, everything was novel. But when I was trusting someone enough to put to you know, open to them enough so that they can put me in a trance, everything was like this. I mean, you know, and those weird experiences were actually, to me, it was important to have them, because that actually convinced me that I'm in an altered state. Erickson would say, and or Dr. Rossi also would say, that this is, how do they call that? I just, the word pop out of my head, but it was like ratification. Yeah, the ratification of a trance, that someone can actually experience, and being aware that they are not aware of something, or being aware that something's automatic, like in this moment. That was my experience, you know. So whatever strange happened, it was like, wow, I'm really in a different state. And I can also see it in my clients when we're working, we can work in a trance in such a way that they don't know that they are in a trance, and that reduces the resistance, strategic resistance towards the procedure and everything else. But also, on the other hand, when they can experience something like that, you know, they can experience like catalepsy, or the paralysis of the whole body, or different like sensations, or hallucination, or anything like that, then that is a powerful tool to kind of deepen the change, because then, you know, the whole experience becomes something else, something different. And then, you know, many people are convinced by that kinds of things, that they really can do something. And sometimes even it goes, I mean, in my experience, to, from this point, since I know how to do this, I also be able to do this and that, for example.
A lot of confidence.
So it's like, yeah, exactly. So that was my experience. And I also think, to put that into conclusion, that sometimes it's important for the client, sometimes, to actually experience those things on their own and be aware that they are not aware of everything in this particular moment.
Yes. I mean, I think that it's human nature to take yourself too seriously, and that there's all of these other outside influences and internal influences that if you only have the awareness to be able to access that, it might help you. And that's really the story. What were you thinking, Roxy?
Well, I was just thinking about a fellow that I saw a few weeks ago, and at the time we were talking about setting goals for therapy, and that I didn't care whether the subject knew whether they were hypnotized or not. The measure of success is going to be something that we mutually agree upon. And the fellow that I had seen that day, he was a painter, but he was an artist, and he was experiencing some artist block. He wasn't able to, and he said he would look at the canvas and it would just be all black, and he couldn't get moving. And so I used, some hypnotic suggestion with him, and indirect. It was all indirect. And then at the conclusion of the session, I don't like to debrief. That's not my style. I don't debrief. But then the next time that the client comes in, I ask him, what do you remember about the trance state? Okay. And so he came in 2 weeks later, and he said, well, the hypnosis didn't work. He heard every word, and he didn't think the hypnosis was necessary. And so I said, okay, well, do you want to continue coming in, or do where are we going from here? I kind of switched to that. And he said, no, he definitely needed to talk with me about it. And so when the conversation wheeled around to, how are you doing with your artwork, which I was tread very lightly with that. And he said, well, when he had left my office, he'd seen this little Mylar balloon, and he took a picture of it, and he pulls it up in his phone. He shows it to me, and I just looked at it. I couldn't make heads or tails about what's interesting about a Mylar balloon. And then he said, I think this is going to work for me. And I'm like, oh, okay. That'll be interesting to see. So then on his third appointment, he came in, and I was open with them. I says, we can do hypnosis, we can talk about your artwork, we can talk about your neighbors. This is I'm here to serve you. And he said, well, he wanted to talk about his artwork, and he drew up on his phone these images that he had. It was like the glint of light off of the Mylar balloon. It was as if it opened a channel into his unconscious mind. He painted the most beautiful pictures. It was just awe-inspiring. And so then I felt a little freedom to ask him, well, how did that come about? Or tell me more about it. And he's like, well, it's just flowing right through him. It's like there's no intentionality. It's just, it's just coming out of his paintbrush on the canvas. And I'm like, oh, wow, that's exciting, isn't it? So then he concluded after 3 sessions. That was, the first session was the hypnotic session, which he declared didn't work. The second session was that he had this glimmer of the Mylar balloon, and the third that he was flowing. Okay, so, I had told him on the first visit when we set the measure of success, I don't care whether you enjoy hypnosis. I don't care whether you feel like you're hypnotized. I don't care whether it's a comfortable experience or whether you feel like you're working really hard. That's not what we're here for. We're here for you to make some, advancement towards resolution of the problems that bring you into my office today. And so that was, in a way, that whole experience, was it the hypnosis that opened the door? Well, I think it was, but maybe it wasn't. But I don't need to know whether it was or wasn't, because he got the movement flowing in the way it needed to flow. And that's a mind-body integration that that goes beyond logical, conscious, cognitive understanding or ability to really explain.
And well, what's interesting about that is that I know that a lot of the ways that people are looking at things is, strategy. How do you get from here to there? It's like where our field is right now. And I really respect it big time. But then there's this story that you're telling. And it's that no matter what strategy you as the therapist might have in mind was actually irrelevant.
Right.
Because he got what he needed in the way that he needed to get it. And that there isn't this through line of cognition of, well, I got to point A, then I went to point B, then I went to point C. And I find this so often in the world of therapeutic hypnosis, and that it's way okay if you, the therapist, are seeing it one way. I would be seeing it the same way you saw it, Roxy. But it's okay that you see it this way, but he didn't. And
right.
And I think that this kind of flexibility of mind is that, something that I appreciate about you. You're a really solid, good person. And you also don't have an ego. It's like, hey, however it comes, if it works for you, I'm good with that. And I think that if there is a strategy to apply along here, it's in making the flow of these things, and not as a therapist being attached to how the outcome happens. And, as far as I'm concerned, as you talk about this case, and the first one was hypnosis, the second one was didactic, so it was talking, and the third one was really integration,
right.
what he got. So when you can look at it in retrospect, well, then that's the strategy. That the first session was hypnosis, and the second one was didactic, and the third one was putting it all together.
Right.
It's only after the fact that we can describe it. And yet, with the next person that comes in, will that work? Or could it be that the first 3 sessions of one person happens to be hypnosis, and then you have 2 that is didactic and 1 that is integration, or 2 or 3 or whatever? I mean, so it can be kind of a little bit of a model, but it's the flexibility that matters. And that I'm with you. If that client if they got what they needed, yes. Yeah.
Right. As far as gratification goes, I've found myself, good work, Roxy. And I even joke with the client, I'm going to claim this as a success, even though I know you did all the work. And
I'll claim it.
With that, I'm still going to mark it down as a plus for me. So I can joke with people about the success that they make, even as I'm indirectly, reinforcing, I'm acknowledging that whatever work went on inside you went on inside you.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, that comes back to the axiom of the burden of psychotherapy is on the client. And on the therapist, we do our best to kind of guide, maybe coach, I mean, having this flexibility so that they can find their own unique way. And so I think that when we really talk about, body mind therapy, what we're saying is, let's bring the whole person in, and wholeness really matters to me. And if somebody comes in and what is their experience of wholeness is being with their mind, great. So I don't push the body thing, even though that's the orientation I come from. It's really what's whole for you, what's working for you.
Yeah, and I would add to the previous, to the fact, because you said about the burden of, you mentioned the burden of responsibility on a client. I need to build on that a bit more, because that's actually important. But many people actually say that the burden of responsibility is on a client, and that kind of, nowadays, it even to me sometimes becomes a phrase that people repeat, but they don't actually,
that's not meaningful.
Exactly. But I mean, so generally, probably most of the therapists would agree nowadays that the burden of responsibility is on the client, as opposed to what was, let's say, in the modern psychotherapy in like 80s or 70s or 60s. But there's a huge depth in this actual statement, because one thing that we are actually referring here to is the fact that the technique is good only if it helps the client. So we can actually have the incredible technique, so complex and so deep, that actually will do nothing, and then you can do a simple thing, and then that's it, that works for the client. And the other thing, the coolest thing, actually, I think it was David Burns who did a research, and what he did, he actually was asking, he did a quite simple thing, because he was asking the therapists about how do they think the session went on, what do they think, if they were helpful, if the session was helpful to the client, and so on. And then he did the same with the clients. He asked the clients, what do they think about the session? And there was no correlation at all. So many times the therapists thought that the session was super great, incredible, and the client would say that it was crappy and nothing actually was involving, or nothing happened. And then many times on the opposite end of that, therapists would say, this session was crappy, nothing happened, and the client was, this session was the best out of all. So generally, what David Burns actually showed is that how therapists evaluate the session doesn't match at all how clients evaluate the session. So that's one thing, and it's actually, to me, that was pretty interesting in terms of the burden of responsibility. But also, the other thing, from the point, since I represent the strategic kind of point of view, so how I see it, I mean, you can have a strategy in your mind, and you can have a plan, and then you can have the goals and everything set. And it's very important for me, actually, to know what I'm doing and be like, of course, following the client, but at the same time looking a bit ahead of the time, and kind of plan and then modify it and so on. But then I also am totally aware that this is my hypothesis, and I mean, it's good to have it because it's good to know what you're doing. But then at the same time, I'm totally aware that what works in this process is client insight and clients' associations and clients' ways of utilizing their own resources and everything else. So I'm actually only activating things. So what this comes to is that you can have a strategy and it may work, but you never know if that what worked was the same thing that you were thinking to do. So, so you know,
I agree. And, you know, relatively early on in my career, I made an experiment with myself on that. And because, you know, I mean, I was like relatively new and, you know, as a therapist, and I wanted to know, was I effective? And so I would have an idea of what I thought was the turning point in the session. And so I would ask the client, because they would agree, yeah, that something really happened here. This is great. And I would say, what was the turning point for you? Not once was it what I thought it was for me. And so it's kind of fun. It's sort of like when it's appropriate, because you don't want to impede on that client. You know, you want them to continue doing what they're doing. But it made me so humble when that was the case, because, you know, again, I mean, it was early on, and I was thinking that, you know, maybe I knew something. And I do, of course, you know, we all know things, but that my turning point of where I'm really sensing it, it's okay if it's not the same as the clients, as long as they get there.
Yeah.
And then I had one experience. There was one day, and I was very good about not bringing my own problems into, you know, I left those outside of the therapy room. But there was one day that I just took a real huge emotional blow. And I honestly could not pay attention to a single client that came in that day. And there was 6 of them. And as I'm sitting there with them, and I was saying to myself, when I see them next time, I'm not going to charge them for the session, because I wasn't emotionally there. And so that's how I dealt with my own, you know, ethics on the situation. And half of them said, you know, I don't know, I want to pay. That was like the best session we ever did. And again, it's like this really humble place of the fact that at least I was acknowledging to them. And in each case, I did not accept money for that next session. And I said, I have to do this for me, because if I'm not emotionally here and 100% for you, I can't take your money. I'm so happy it worked out well for you. I really am. But I got to go with my own morals and ethics. And it was just, I'm happy to tell you, all these years, it was just that one day. But it taught me a lot about it. And, you know, again, sometimes it's, you know, it's okay to ask, you know, sometimes it's not. But I think that just about anyone, you're going to be surprised if you check in of that maybe you planted a seed in what you thought was the turning point. But, you know, that seed maybe had to grow a little bit. And so that they found that there was a different turning point with it, or their realization when there's a turning point, because there's often a lag time with that. But yes, I mean, it's and as we talk, it's like, do we really know anything? Do we have so much to learn? And
we're constantly learning, and we're constantly, you know, not know so much, and we're learning to go around it.
Well, yeah. And, you know, I mean, and Ernie and I used to say every day we're in kindergarten, we're here to learn. And which I think is a really good thing. But it's good to be able to have a great sense of humor about how we really do go in and we give our best at the time. Almost every therapist is giving the best that they can at the time.
Yeah.
And or at least that's, you know, how you go to sleep really well at night, knowing you did the best you could at the time. And that our joy is when you see somebody getting what they want, whether it was your strategy or your method or your getting them to move or not move. that's really where the joy is.
Mhm. Yes.
And actually, they did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm thinking that we've had a great time with this subject matter, and of course, we could go on for another 300 or 400 hours on this because of the strategies and the interests and this and that. But we've had another successful time of 3 really independent thinking therapists that have had so much blessed success with our clients to help them to get what they want. And we all work a little bit differently, and we're really good about listening to each other. And I know I certainly learned a few things today that I'm going to apply.
Yeah. Same.
Yes. And that's the joy of listening to other peers and colleagues, that they've got approaches that we may not use, but we can still learn from them.
Exactly. Sometimes we may not even think about them, but then when someone tells us, it's like, highlighting new horizons.
Exactly. Right. It goes into the well, maybes.
Exactly.
Maybe I could.
By the way, I don't know if anyone noticed, but today, we can do this because we are at the same spot. Dr. Katrin Rossi is today with me in Zakopane in Lesser Poland district of the Republic of Poland, Europe.
Having an amazing time. I'm just in love with the Polish people and how they think and how they strategize. And this is just a real blessing to be here.
And we're trying to convince Dr. Roxanna Erickson to come here and visit us one day or another in the future. Now.
Thank you for the invite.
You never know, Roxy. You never know.
You're always welcome, and be aware that this actual place that we are in has actually 2 separate bedrooms and 1 additional living room. So, you can have
yes, we could be together, and it's very luxurious, and the mountains right outside the window, and you never know, Roxy.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much for this outstanding, incredible podcast on body-mind approach to hypnotherapy and also on deep trance a bit. So once again, thank you very much and see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
This was another episode of our Experiencing Consciousness podcast. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Jan. You're the best. Be well, be happy, celebrate life.